So, guys, this is part two of a conversation about metabolic acidosis, with part one really just being a fun, sort of foundational framework for this conversation. And maybe we can start off by summarizing it. The summary is actually just distilling a core fundamental concept that is, I think, readily apparent upon brief reflection, which is the first is that whenever somebody has a metabolic acidosis, we all know that the acidosis is such a serious thing that it requires prompt attention. And so, what naturally happens next when you see that the pH is low and the cause for it is a metabolic acidosis, you start to think about, oh gosh, is my patient in trouble? And I need to figure out what is going on. And we talked briefly about moving the benchmark a little bit, and the benchmark that I'm referring to here is the original, and I think likely persistent desire to lump metabolic acidosis into non-GAP versus GAP. And what that fundamentally is referring to is saying, is the gap that is being created either filled by chloride, which is what's called a non-GAP acidosis, or filled by something else? And we talked about how that distinction is understandable because chloride itself is an endogenous molecule that has no intrinsic toxicity. In stark contrast, many of the causes of an anion gap metabolic acidosis have their own intrinsic toxicities, which is why we tend to panic a little bit more when we see that the patient has an anion gap metabolic acidosis. But our conversation yesterday was sort of saying, well, let's take anion gap metabolic acidosis with a fine comb and say, is that true that all these things have inherent toxicities? And we came to the conclusion that lactates and ketones are a physiological product of physiological metabolism that tend to have little to no inherent toxicities themselves. And so a helpful approach, a more practical approach to the anion gap to metabolic acidosis is to ask yourself, do you need to worry about the molecule itself? And the answer that we came to for chloride, lactate, and ketones is essentially none. And you will find exceptions to this abound, of course, but they're all really, really rare. So I'll just put a pin just to say that an exception is one thing we've talked about before, an entity called ketotic hepatopathy, where ketones are damaging and hurt the liver. But if I have to use and resort to something like ketotic hepatopathy as an exception to this otherwise helpful rule, it's not worth remembering this exception unless you're in that very exceptional circumstance. So essentially, instead of calling a metabolic acidosis as a gap or non-gap, it's probably more practically helpful to say, is it an endogenous molecule or an exogenous one? And if it's an endogenous molecule, the molecule itself is not intrinsically toxic. And so all that you're left to try to understand to help your patient is, of course, first, to temporize the consequences of the acidosis itself, which will be a universal feature of the care of these patients. But now, instead of fixating on the consequences of these endogenous molecules, what you then instead have to do is actually ask, why are these things happening in the first place? And realize that the generation of lactates, ketones, and chloride is merely a adaptive physiological response to a perturbance that is happening in the body elsewhere, and that is what needs your attention. To a patient with lactic acidosis, the reflex to correct their hemodynamic status, often by giving them fluids, has nothing to do with the toxic effects of lactate itself, beyond its effects on the pH. It rather has to do with correcting the very driver of lactic acidosis in most people, a hemodynamic insult. The drive to give somebody insulin with diabetic ketoacidosis has nothing to do with any toxicity of the ketotic molecule beyond its effect on the pH, but rather to suppress the underlying driver of ketone generation. The driver to give normal saline in a patient who has had or a normal saline or lactated ringers or whatever isotonic fluid, and a patient who has a chloride related non-GAP metabolic acidosis is not to fix any issues with the chloride itself beyond pH, but rather, gosh, I'm getting tired, rather to fix the underlying issue of volume changes here, right? You get the premise. Ethylene glycol toxicity, methanol toxicity, salicylate toxicity, blank toxicity. There is no underlying physiological internal perturbance. It's all about the molecule, what it does. So whenever you have a patient with an acidosis, a metabolic acidosis, it's really important to ask yourself, what am I going to fixate on beyond the pH itself? And unfortunately, whenever the pH is so extreme, it's hard to fixate about anything. You get so focused on, oh my gosh, I have to put this patient on bicarb drip or dialysis, and it's really, really hard to think. But it's so important to have a structured approach to what you have to do independent of the pH, and simplifying that approach is key because the panic that ensues in a severe metabolic acidosis is huge. And I can imagine in Lorenzo's case, I know he wasn't part of the original care, received the patient, but I imagine you have pH of 6, 7, you're like line dialysis, what's happening? And so, one very helpful thing that tends to happen that gives us peace of mind is when we identify chloride, lactate, or ketones. We're like, okay, breathe easy. There's an internal physiological perturbance that I have to now solve. And so there can naturally be less of an emphasis on things coming from the outside, which is why these toxidromes like ethylene glycol and methanol, um, uh, uh, one of the ways you can suspect them is you see an non-GAP metabolic acidosis and you don't find chloride, lactate, or ketones. And so this is reflection 2.0 about fine-tuning that assessment a little bit. And we have to fine-tune it by first generating a rapid conceptual model of what generates lactate and what generates ketones. Okay. So, Simi, if you're just going on reflex and going on what's common, what would you say are common causes of a lactate acidosis?
Hi, Rob. Hi, everyone. Rabih, I think infection and ischemia are common causes that we associate with it.
Excellent. Keep going. Anything else that you can think of just to finish your list?
Probably that's all I can think of for now.
You got 90% of all causes of lactic acidosis, and the causes that you mentioned actually have a specific category. They're called type A lactic acidosis, with the unifying mechanism seeming being that there's tissue hypoxia. And whenever there's no blood making it to tissues, either because they're ischemic or because they're pathologically vasodilated from sepsis, lactate is generated, and that's called type A lactic acidosis. There's a whole other form of lactic acidosis called type B lactic acidosis, where there's lactate generation despite intact perfusion. So, Jillian, have you come across this entity before? What's your understanding of that space of type B lactic acidosis?
My understanding is that there's a problem with lactate metabolism, I
Excellent.
guess. Maybe due to, well, like the first thing honestly that comes to mind is like medications like metformin could cause it, or uh yeah, I guess. And then maybe cancer too, like the
Beautiful.
metabolic disturbances with cancer or other like metabolic derangements.
Yeah,
Maybe, yeah.
you've named the two categories. There's really fundamentally two mechanisms by which you can generate more lactate without hypoperfusion. And the first is that you poison the mitochondria. And this emphasizes how crucial mitochondria are for energy generation, that even if you get blood to the cells, if the cells can't use them, uh, then the blood might as well not be there. And so mitochondrial toxicity is a very profound and common theme for type B lactic acidosis. And the mitochondrial toxicity can occur because of substances that the patient ingested, including metformin, um, and many others. It can also occur because of deficiencies in critical nutrients that are required for energy funneling to the mitochondria, and that's where thiamine comes in. By mentioning cancer, you mentioned another really important category, which is called hyperglycolysis, where glycolysis, where you stimulate cells to make a whopping amount of energy for no good reason and to consume a lot of glucose for no good reason. And that term is called the Warburg effect, and it's how cancers do so. You can have hyperglycolysis by abnormal cells creating too much energy consumption, but also by excessive stimulation of beta 2 receptors. And beta 2 receptors tell the cells to go, 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 which is why when you give somebody albuterol, you might see a lactic acidosis when you douse them with albuterol in a continuous nebulizer. That stimulates their beta 2 cells, and that makes their cells go bonkers and make a lot of lactate. So if you give me license to share with you the progress that I think you can make by narrating this is to ask yourself, maybe I should think about lactate as either an internal issue or an external issue. And Simi's main focus was internal issues, that the patient essentially has cardiovascular collapse of some kind, that the lesion and the root of their generation of lactic acidosis sits within their cardiovascular system as causing hypoperfusion. It's not working. And that, by far and away, is the most morbid cause of a lactic acidosis. If your cardiovascular system is on the verge of collapsing, that's an internal issue and that needs to be addressed. Jillian brought up a couple of other internal issues, one of which is cancers. That's a really important internal issue of lactic acidosis generation. And there are a few other ones. To round up the list, it includes a FeO. A FeO can cause hyperglycolysis by secreting beta cell tumors, secreting catecholamines that stimulate the beta cell receptors. You can also have certain forms of liver disease that generate lactate and don't clear lactate. So if I'm thinking, hey, is my lactate as it often is supposed to be, is this an internal issue with my patient's body? The answer is overwhelmingly yes in the vast majority of people. Cardiovascular dysfunction is by far and away the most common, but rarely. The internal structural issue is either a mass, widespread cancer, or a mass in the adrenals, a FeO, or the internal structural issues in the liver. So when I see a lactic acidosis, I'm jumping to the cardiovascular system. And the truth is, when the cardiovascular system is generating a lactic acidosis, it's not subtle. You will not have, as in Lorenzo's case, a heart rate of 78 and a blood pressure of 140 or 75. So then I ask myself, is this a problem with a cancer? Widespread cancer causing the Warburg effect? Patient was fine yesterday. Mm-mm. Is this a problem with the liver? Liver enzymes are normal. Where is this lactate coming from? And this is a really powerful reminder that there are many exogenous issues that stimulate lactate production. And we're going to come back to this conversation, but I'll tell you the exact same thing happens with ketosis. So if I were to ask you all, and I won't for the sake of time, hey, let's go through causes of ketosis, you would naturally think, oh my gosh, most of the issues are having to do with the body itself not making enough insulin. And the reason that the body itself is not making enough insulin is because you have diabetes or you're starving. But the very term alcoholic ketoacidosis is a humbling reminder that an exogenous ingestion can also generate ketones. So let's go back a little bit. When you get a metabolic acidosis and you get chloride, lactate, or ketones, odds are odds are that there's something wrong inside the body. And if it's a chloride problem, there's something wrong with the GI tract or the kidneys. Diarrhea, or you have some really interesting renal issues that are intrinsic to the body. If you have a lactic acidosis, odds are you have cardiovascular collapse. And if not, you might have some internal issues with cancers, PHOs, or liver disease. If you have ketones, odds are you have diabetes or you're starving, but it's not foolproof. If you have a metabolic acidosis and you have not identified chloride, ketones, or lactate, you need to panic because that is an exogenous molecule causing that acidosis. And it will be an anion gap acidosis. But even if you have lactates or ketones, you have to be open to the possibility that there is an exogenous stimulant of that disease process. And why does that happen? Lactates and ketones are at the intersection of energy generation. And there are so many exogenous substances that can hijack that system, fooling you into thinking that your problem is a perfusional one with lactate or an insulin one with ketones, when it's actually a molecule hijacking the nutritional apparatus. I'll say that one more time. What's the common theme between lactates and ketones? Feeding cells. Hungry cells. Not getting blood, lactate. Not having enough insulin to bring sugar in, ketones. And there are many molecules that can be ingested that hijack that apparatus, fooling you into thinking that you have an intrinsic energy crisis, but you don't. You took a bunch of metformin that poisoned your mitochondria, making you think that you have an energy crisis, but you don't. You took a bunch of methanol that also poisoned your mitochondria, making you think that you have an energy crisis, but you don't. You took a lot of cocaine, stimulating your beta 2 receptors, making you think you have an energy crisis, but you don't. You took a lot of isopropyl alcohol that got metabolized to acetone that made you think you have an energy crisis, but you don't. And that's so key. So how do we know that this is happening? The common theme for most of these ingestions is they profoundly and deeply affect the brain. How does a patient with severe endogenous lactic acidosis or ketosis present? Let me tell you. You have cardiovascular collapse. You're coming in with multi-organ failure. For those of you in grand rounds yesterday, that's how you present. If you have really bad endogenous ketosis, you present with abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. None of those patients are deeply and profoundly, but importantly, disproportionately confused. Now, if you have cardiovascular collapse and you're confused, that's fine. But let me take you to Lorenzo's case. He came in, he was confused. Right? Focus on the patient. He's confused. His vitals are normal, his temperature is normal. And yet, he has a pH of 6.7 and an unmeasurably high lactate. the most profound clue to the presence of an exogenous substance triggering and metabolic acidosis is the realization that that exogenous substance has profoundly strong effects on the brain, and that these patients present with inebriation or intoxication. And so, if I were to share with you what kinds of substances do this, they largely come in three categories with alcohols. And I think if I were to tell you a story, if you were maybe from Mars and didn't know that ethanol existed, and told you a story of this patient who came in wobbling and slurring speech and had an interesting odor to his breath, and his vitals were fine, but gosh, he had a really bad metabolic acidosis. There's a lot of lactate and a lot of ketones. Now, if you're on Earth, you'd be like, oh my gosh, he's drunk. And he's got a lactic acidosis and ketones because that's what alcohol does. Well, why? Why does it do that? It's hijacking your energy metabolism. And thankfully, at concentrations that most people consume alcohol at, you'll clear it. And most importantly, you'll clear it without generating a toxic metabolite. This is why ethanol is not labeled as a toxic alcohol. But is this any different than a patient who takes ethylene glycol toxicity? The answer is no. Unfortunately, ethylene glycol toxicity, propylene glycol toxicity, and even isopropyl alcohol toxicity all have other consequences. Some of the consequences are because a subset of them induce an even more toxic molecule, which is true for ethylene glycol and propylene glycol. For isopropyl alcohol, it causes such bad consequences on the lungs and the pancreas itself, but thankfully does not generate a toxic metabolite. So these things are really bad for your body. And ethanol has pervaded into our culture because it's thankfully its toxicity is not as severe acutely as some of the other ones. The other category are salicylates. So salicylates come in. How does somebody with salicylate toxicity present? Confusion and tinnitus. And the last is a whole variety of really important medications that interfere with your mitochondria and they poison your mitochondria. Metformin is by far and away the most important one because is so prevalent, but isoniazid, linezolid, chloramphenicol, cyanide, there's so many of them that they knock out your mitochondria and you cannot use oxygen. And guess what feels it first? Right. So Maddie emphasized that the biggest clue to the presence of these exogenous substances is that you can measure them by detecting an osmolar gap. And that is basically that you use all the molecules that you have measured, the sodium, the glucose, everything, not to go into too much detail, and you add those up and say, how many osms should I have in my body based on measuring the ones I know should be there? And so you add them all up and you calculate your anticipated osms. And then you also at the same time ask the lab to measure them directly. And what you should expect is that they line up, that what you are measuring, the sodium, the glucose, everything is as expected. But when the lab tells you, hey, no, your number's off by 20 or 30, you know that there's something you're not measuring, and that's an exogenous substance. It's a very powerful supporting measure to say, hey, this person has a bunch of methanol or a bunch of ethylene glycol or a bunch of salicylates or a bunch of anything that shouldn't be there. But do not overlook the fact that your clue to the presence of an osm gap is the universal presence of encephalopathy. And it's not just encephalopathy, it's a disproportionate, unexpected encephalopathy for the syndrome itself. So the exercise that I ask you to do when you look at Lorenzo's case again is to just pretend that you are looking at the vitals and the labs and ask yourselves, what do you think the patient presented with? What's their chief concern? And many times when you are facing a case of an anion gap metabolic acidosis, you might say the patient presented with fevers, fatigue, malaise, or you might have said, oh, if they're ketones, the patient presented with abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. No, this patient was found down, unresponsive, right? That combo is really, really crucial. So I have one other element to share with you all. Um, but let me take a minute to summarize the key points and see what questions or reflections you have. Key points are that in most instances, when you find chloride, lactate, and ketones, the problem's internal. But there are a small number of substances that can mimic the internal energy crisis that is often induced by lactates and ketones. And those substances either block your mitochondria or stimulate your beta 2 receptors, but they do something to interfere with your energy metabolism short of hypoperfusion or impaired insulin generation. They do so in different ways. And so you might see a lactate and a ketones as a consequence of that specific molecule. But what will be universal for all those patients is the effects of that molecule on the brain will be deep and profound and disproportional. And unlike anything that you will see an endogenous cause of a lactate or ketones do. And that's your biggest clue. Okay. So let me stop there and see what questions or reflections you all have, and then I'll share with you another, hopefully simplified way of looking at this. Yeah, Leah, go for it.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for this interesting concept and simplifying it. The one thought or reflection I had, or question more, is where would you put phosphates from failure causing an AGMA? Because I was thinking if I had to put it in one of the two, like it would also be obviously like an endogenous cause. And also, and here's where I'm not quite sure because I'm lacking the experience to with lots of renal failure patients to that extent who have like this AGMA, but I would not expect that severe of encephalopathy level. However, I know urea can cause like encephalopathy too. So basically, I don't know. And my question is, where would you put the elevated phosphate as a cause in
Yeah.
this scheme?
I think, yeah, I would recommend that you reach out to Sana after the session because you guys are kindred spirits. Sana asked me the exact same question yesterday. And I think it's such a helpful point because probably many people weren't there and it deserves re-emphasis. The very principle, Leah, if we go back to the principle of classifying these things, why are we classifying them as endogenous or exogenous? What we're really after is not what we don't, why do we fundamentally care where they're coming from? What we're really after is the key question is, does this molecule have intrinsic toxicity to the body? Right? And so if you were to ask yourself that question, do you believe that phosphates and sulfates that accumulate in kidney disease have intrinsic toxicities to them? The answer would be no. Don't really harm the body in any way beyond the effects on the pH, right? So I would certainly classify them under that category as an endogenous issue. And the idea being is that these are actually molecules that live happily and healthily inside your cells. And you excrete them at a very slow, measurable rate. The rate of excretion has to increase dramatically when you burst your cells, like in rhabdomyolysis. Um, but these molecules live in a very happy medium with your body and actually just processed consequences of food intake rather than anything toxic. So, fundamentally, I think if you were to take this to the extreme, everything that your body is built on comes in some sense from the outside, including this yogurt, this granola that I have. And so if you were to, I think, back trace the lactate molecule that I'm referring to as an endogenous one that's made by the body, you'll probably find that its components at some point existed outside the world. And so this is the problem with these artificial frameworks is they have many gaps in them, and there are many others as well. And so if to help you clarify any confusion, I think you go back to the intrinsic principle of are these things toxic or not? And I think lactate itself doesn't do anything bad to the body beyond the pH. Ketones don't either. And as far as I know, neither do sulfates and phosphates. At least not to the extent that methanol or ethylene glycol does. Really, really good question. Other questions, though?
Um,
Yeah,
in the
Krishna.
session,
Yeah.
you mentioned about lactate gap
Yeah.
in the chat.
Mhm.
Could you explain to us a little bit about how that would differ between VBG and a lab value?
Excellent. So I've saved your. Let's go to the punchline now. So let me show you the picture. There's two other things I want to show you really quickly. Oopsie. Oh. So we spent a lot of time talking about this, right? Oh, sorry, I should orient you. We are in how do I know this is an exogenous issue? The biggest clue, frankly, which is not here, is that you have no lactates, ketones, or chloride. You have no reason why the patient has an anagap metabolic acidosis. Boom, easy. And I have that captured here a little bit, but we'll talk about that. So this is your biggest clue. All these patients come in, they're inebriated, confused, something's wrong with their brain. And all that is happening, and if you look at Lorenzo's case, all that is happening is the patient is confused and acidotic, nothing else. And this is the center of gravity here. The laboratory clues are the osmolar gap, which Maddie emphasized yesterday, unaccounted anions. So the easiest form of unaccounted anions is there is no lactate ketones at all, nothing. And so they're completely unaccounted. But if you have this much loss in bicarb and only this much ketones and lactates, it's the rest. So you got to crunch the numbers. And then Krishna, you're asking about this artifact. Let's zoom in on that in a moment, but to emphasize this aspect too, these are things that are horrible and bad, and your patient will get worse and worse and worse and worse. Most of the time, when somebody comes in with lactic acidosis or ketoacidosis, their worst will be when you first met them. And because all of you are so good, you will make your patient gradually better. Or they may not get better at all, but they won't get worse on you. Excuse me. But these, as we saw in Lorenzo's case, worse, 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 worse. Horrible toxic molecule. And so one other thing that they do is because our is because the lab is really not used to these things being in the body, it confuses the heck out of many things that we test in the lab. And over time, you'll learn that every single ingestion does something funky to the lab. What does ethylene glycol do? Ethylene glycol generates no lactate or ketones by itself. None. And what it does, though, is it produces a toxic molecule called glycolytic acid. And for some reason, glycolytic acid is actually measured only on the point of care ABG or VBG machine. And it is measured and captured as lactate incorrectly. So let me read you again Lorenzo's ABG. pH of 6.7, PaCO2 of 18, bicarb of 18, excuse me, which means there's only 6 bicarbonates gone from the 24 that is normal, 6. Lactate, unmeasurably high. Doesn't add up. That's a fake lactate. Now, how do you know that? You can't assume that in that moment You know that is you send off the serum lactate and it is maybe 3 or 4 or something. That's what's called the lactate gap. So ethylene glycol creates a fake out on the ABG analyzer. Um, and isopropyl alcohol causes a ketone gap. Um, and many there are other really cool, interesting concepts, but the premise is that these molecules mess up the lab in some way, shape, or form. Is really cool. Cool. Okay, I have a really, really important thing to give you, not to fully iron out today, but for you to reflect on. And it is emphasizing when somebody is confused, their acid-base status is key. Okay? So I want you to think about this, okay? For the future. When you get a blood gas in a confused patient and you get a respiratory acidosis, that's very easy, right? Do that all the time. That's why Sarah and her consult notes will be like, please get a VBG for rule out hypercarbia. I already see it. This is what we celebrate and why we get EBGs and VBGs in patients who are confused. I will tell you any abnormal result is a clue. If you get a metabolic acidosis, now you know. And exogenous substances. If somebody is deeply confused and has a metabolic acidosis, look outside their body. Somebody's deeply confused and has a respiratory alkalosis, whew, hyperammonemia, some other things too. Or if somebody has a really bad metabolic alkalosis and confused, their metabolic alkalosis is affecting the respiratory center. I can talk about that later, but I will share this with you all for you just to stew on. But the simple learning point is anytime you get a profoundly abnormal ABG or VBG in somebody who's confused, especially in somebody who has encephalopathy out of proportion to anything else, the acid-base status often holds a profound clue as to the nature of the patient's encephalopathy. Yeah, suck it. There you go.
Sorry, Dr. Rabih. That was
Yeah.
a mistake.
Oh, it's all good. It's all good. No worries. I would love to hear from Austin. I know you were I'm not sure what the status of your voice is. I hate to put you on the spot, but yeah, I'm really curious what, you went through this journey in real time, a very, very difficult case. I know I don't see Lorenzo anymore. I think he was working. But yeah, I'm really curious what your take is, what your reflections are.
Yeah, I think thanks so much for educating me a lot on this. And you definitely taught us about the sort of idea of endogenous versus exogenous before. And it's really nice to have that spaced repetition and then to take it a step further. I haven't had a chance to go back and watch my discussion yet. So I always do that just to make sure that I can sort of hone my skills. And I feel like I recall. Um, Discussing the idea, I was like, wow, the lactate seems very disproportionate to what is going on in
Yeah,
this
you definitely
picture,
did.
but I didn't articulate it in the moment. And I think the main, I mean, there's so many great points here, and I kind of wrote some notes down about everything that's going on. But I think to your point, it's like we've sort of discussed this theme before, but it's the idea of when you see enough patients that have an understanding, like disproportionality is huge, and disproportionality comes in microscopic forms and macroscopic. It can
Yeah.
come in like every day I catch up on the like Dr. Smith's ECG blog, and it's all about the disproportionality of the ST segment T wave changes. In this case, it was the disproportionality, like grossly, of wow, the patient is profoundly encephalopathic. And then I even said in my discussion with our calls, like, wow, this patient is like surprisingly unsick, like for someone that is like uptighted.
Yes.
Which again, I didn't put together in the time. This could be a toxin. But then the other thing is like from a microscopic standpoint, like wow, the lactate is like undetectably high, and the pH is stunningly low. Like if my wife got called for a pH 6.7, the first thing is like, does the patient have a pulse? And like, are they alive? Because seeing someone with the pH that low, like it's very rare. Like it's so unheard of because it usually causes cardiovascular collapse, like to your point that you alluded before. So I think my main takeaway was like there was many clues to disproportionality, both on a macroscopic and microscopic level. And I think I articulated those things, but I didn't really discuss those things in detail. And those were really the pivot points that could have led to this type of conversation and made progress. So I really appreciate you educating me on
Yeah.
that.
Well, no, you're too kind, and I will refer you to a VMR in April of 2021. And my memory for VMR specific dates is poor, but this one, yeah, I'll remember forever for two reasons. The first, it was Steph Sherman who presented the case, and the second is actually the first discussion I'd ever had with Kara ever. Um, and Steph presented a case of ethylene glycol toxicity. And my understanding of that space at that time was not even close to what it needed to be to take excellent care of the patient if I were there by myself. And I learned so much from that case. And I sense that you're on a very similar journey from yours. But yeah, that's the beauty. Everything that I just shared with you is a work in progress, built on seeing cases and stumbling through them. And yeah, that's the beauty of what we get to do now is we get to actually intermix our reflections and thoughts and elevate each other rather than just do it in a siloed space. And I think the ability to make progress is much, much, much higher this way. Yeah, Krishna.
Sorry, Dr. Ravi, I just had one question. Um, in the regular workflow of interpreting an ABG, we first validate it and then we see whether the PCO2 is normal or not. Then we look at whether it is acidemia or acidosis, and then we see whether it is normal or high anion gap. If it is high, we calculate the AG delta AG ratio and see if there's any normal anion gap that is additionally complicating this, or if there's any mixed disorders. The regular work, this workflow doesn't fit in calculating the osmolar gap, and at the same time, if you send the patient serum for measured osmolarity, also takes time before it comes back. Is there anything in the regular ABG interpretation workflow that we can include other than the symptomatology that the patient presents with to increase our suspicion towards there being an exogenous substance?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is no. I think the ABG's ability to are really at maximum to tell you if somebody has if somebody has a metabolic acidosis, and if it's an anion gap metabolic acidosis. That's as far as the ABG can tell you. Um, and so then I think at that point you have to take a glance at the patient and say, are they here with disproportionate encephalopathy or not? I think that's your probably most profound input. Yeah, but the ABG itself doesn't have any discriminatory power.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. All right, guys, thanks so much for hanging out. I'll let you stew on this, and there's a lot to reflect and fine tune, but odds are we'll always learn a little bit more here or there with every case. All right, thanks, guys. Catch you later.